A few years ago, the Australian writer Anne Mann argued that many women inhale the benefits of feminism as naturally as the air they breathe. And make no mistake, women, in the Western world at least, have made huge progress in so many aspects of life. But some commentators warn that today's modern feminism is a corruption of what feminism should be. That feminism is no longer about freedom, it's just a lobby group for pet grievances. Not so much about emancipation, it's now reactionary. Christina Hoff Sommers is author of The War Against Boys and Who Stole Feminism. And she's also a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. She's a star of a YouTube series called The Factual Feminist, which holds modern-day feminists to account for crude comments, false statistics and double standards. She was in Australia last week as a guest of the Centre for Independent Studies. G'day, Christina. Welcome to the ABC.
Lovely to be here.
The prevailing wisdom among many Western feminists is that life is as difficult for Western women today than ever. To what extent are women in nations like Australia, Britain, the United States oppressed?
They are not oppressed. They are liberated. They are the beneficiaries of two major waves of feminism. This is not to say they don't have problems. They do. But oppression means that you don't have the same basic rights, and they do. So we're living in a post-oppression era, and the women that are in trouble now are in countries in the Middle East and in parts of Africa where they do not have their basic rights.
And yet many modern-day feminists will still, use all sorts of facts and figures to support their claim that misogyny is alive and well, and they often turn to that gender pay gap as a key point, and we'll often hear that there still is a huge disparity in pay between men and women for the same work.
Yes, that's one of the myths I dispute in The Factual Feminist and in a number of articles, and it's not just me, it's a lot of economists, including some feminist economists. Most of the wage gap can be explained by the fact that women major in different subjects in school, they go into different fields, they work fewer hours on average, and they are more likely to take time out of the workplace. There are probably 20 or 30 factors that go into what determines wages, and men and women simply are different.
So your argument then is women choose career paths that pay less than
Well, look at what they major in.
Choose.
Young women in college, they're much more likely to major in the social sciences or education. The men prevail in engineering and computer science. Right there, it will give the men an advantage.
Well, let's look at Australia. I know you've only been here for a week or so, but Australia's a case study here. The evidence is clear. Something like 60% of university undergraduates in this country are women. That's surely signs of progress. Yet when it comes to entry-level jobs for graduates, there's something like a 2 to 3% pay gap, men to women. Doesn't seem like a huge disparity. But nevertheless, our former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, she recently said this represents, quote, unconscious bias against women, which is still driven by cultural stereotypes.
Oh, well, first of all, if it's 2 or 3%, then again, do we know it's because of discrimination or bias? Is it that women are making different choices, or they do have a somewhat more tenuous relationship with the workplace? And what gender activists have to do is give us an honest accounting, and they rarely do. There's always spin, and they always fail to take account of relevant factors.
What about rape and sexual assault? Again, we often hear evidence, at least in the American context, that shows a large segment of American women, something like 20%, have been sexually assaulted in the last 10, 20 years. And yet, this is intriguing because at the same time, there's a lot of available evidence, at least in the United States, that shows that crime, murder, that's been on a downhill trajectory for the same period. What's going on here?
Well, the rates of rape are down as well, as with all violent crime. The claim that 20% of rape victims or sexual assault victims, that finding is based on what we would call advocacy research, which was research with a predetermined conclusion. They did the research and designed it in order to get an alarming finding. And they do it, or usually they do all three things. They don't interview a representative sample of women. They use very vague terms to define sexual assault and include things that most of us would not think of as rape, for example. They include things like, have you ever had sex when you were under the influence of alcohol? And they'll word that vaguely, and then a lot of people will say yes, but then they will ask them, well, have you ever been raped? And they say no. So there's something amiss with this research. The definitions, the sample of people, and just a number of other methodological problems.
Meanwhile, in Australia, we're having this great debate about increasing women representation in politics. The Education Minister, Christopher Pyne, he's on the right side, or the conservative side of Australian politics. He says that the Liberal Party, the centre-right Liberal Party, needs more female MPs, and other voices in and outside the party support quotas, or at least targets. What's so wrong with that?
Well, first of all, you should have people representing you who were popularly elected and not impose on it this grid and predetermined who will win. It's simply not the case that a man can't represent women or a woman can't represent men. You need the best possible candidates. So I don't see any need for that in a country like Australia, where people are free to run and no one has been able to find bias against women once they run. The problem is getting women to run.
That's right. So your argument, let's just get this clear, is that today's modern feminism is really a corruption of what feminism should be. That is, feminism is no longer about freedom so much. It's just a lobby group for pet grievances.
Exactly. And just say it's almost as if this lobby thinks that it's a zero-sum game out there in society. It's Mars fighting with Venus. They're on Venus's team. Well, most women and men don't see the world that way. We're in this together. And if men are in trouble, women are in trouble, and vice versa.
But Christina, if that is indeed the case, is it accurate to say that women, or at least Western women, and we should distinguish between Western women and non-Western women here at least, that the real challenge now is for women needing liberation from this type of feminism?
Well, I find it oppressive, and recently it's become authoritarian and reactionary. There's a new, in the United States, I don't know if it's come to Australia, I hope it hasn't for your sake, it's a kind of fainting couch feminism, where the female students on our colleges want to have trigger warnings and safe spaces because they're constantly getting PTSD when someone challenges their worldview.
Jeez, extraordinary. My guest today is Christina Hoff Sommers, whose latest book is Freedom Feminism. She's also with the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Christina, let's talk about this hostile response you just alluded to your intellectual work. Now, you've challenged, among other things, the notion of rape culture. You've debunked studies associated with it. Now, at visits to US colleges earlier this year, you were met with such nasty opposition that the school had to increase security. What the hell was going on there?
Yes, at Oberlin College, in Georgetown, when I arrived, the students had issued trigger warnings and they did have safe rooms where students could go. At Oberlin College, they had a safe room and 30 students fled to this room. 30 students and a therapy dog. I think I triggered a dog. It was ridiculous. And, just to be clear, when I question these rape statistics, these young women at Oberlin, terrible things can happen anywhere, and they can happen at Oberlin or at Georgetown, but these young women are among the most protected and privileged in the world, and it's a kind of panic, a contagion of hysteria around this idea that they live in a rape culture. And the sad thing is there are pockets in the United States, especially in urban areas, where women are at severe risk and they don't have the proper rape kits in the hospital. The police are not properly trained. There are a lot of issues around rape that are pressing social problems. But right now, a lot of the resources are going towards these policies for schools, these privileged young women on schools, where they've exaggerated the problem out of all proportion.
And let's get this straight. You yourself, you're an advocate of LGBT rights, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender rights. You're a Democrat, I think. Is that right?
Yes, registered Democrat.
And you're pro-choice on abortion. So you're not a radical right-winger.
No, I've never been a right-winger. I'm a flower child from the 60s.
And yet your
free
views,
speech.
But your views were not just hard to stomach for many students and feminists. They just wanted to shut you down.
Yes, I think they would have had me arrested if they could.
There were multiple undercover police officers there, I'm told.
Well, I don't know how many, but I had police escorts. For the first time in my life, I had police escorts.
To a university campus.
Yes, and the policewomen, there were policewomen at Oberlin. You could see how nervous they were because the students were so angry. And, they demanded a safe space, but the school was concerned about my safety.
Well, what's wrong with dissenting views being heard? In other words, I suppose the point here is modern-day feminism, the one you're describing, is it incompatible with equality genuine liberalism, freedom of each sex to do as it chooses.
Well, it's not about equality. It's about treating women as fragile little birds, as a fainting couch feminism, as I said. It's taking us back to the Victorian age, and I just don't recognize it as feminism. It was something we rebelled against in the late 60s and 70s.
Well, in your work, you've identified a lot of hypocrisy among modern-day feminists, and that hypocrisy has been on display here in Australia just recently. I'll put some context here. A prominent newspaper columnist, Mark Latham, recently tweeted some very crude and rude remarks about a handful of women, and the controversy culminated in Latham losing his newspaper column. But what's striking here, Christina, is how the sisterhood, if you like, became so outraged, but only when it suited them for political purposes, not as a matter of principle. Let me give you an example. When a Fairfax journalist, Clementine Ford, called the Conservative columnist Miranda Devine a effing C on Twitter, that was deemed okay, but it was not okay for Latham to use crude words.
Oh my goodness, she did that? Well, there's a double standard there, and I don't think people should lose their job because of tweets. And I'm tired of that kind of hashtag vigilantism.
What about Barack Obama? He got in strife with feminists 2 years ago. This was a controversial issue. I want to run this by you. You may recall he was at a fundraising lunch and he made the unspeakable error of praising a woman for her looks. This is California's Attorney General Kamala Harris. She's probably the next Democrat senator for California. Let's hear what President Obama said. You have to be careful to, first of all, say she is brilliant and she is dedicated and she is tough. And she is exactly what you'd want in anybody who is administering the law and making sure that everybody is getting a fair shake. She also happens to be by far the best-looking Attorney General in the country. Wow. Now, did Obama cop it? He was denounced as a sexist, a sellout, perhaps even a misogynist. What did the episode reveal to you, Christina?
It revealed to me that he's a normal, well-adjusted person who, and the fact that we have to monitor and police every word and thought. And I'm sure that she appreciated the compliment.
Well, Henry Kissinger once quipped, no one can win the battle of the sexes. After all, there's too much fraternising with the enemy.
Yes.
Christina Hoff Sommers, thanks so much for being on Between the Lines.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
That was Christina Hoff Sommers, and we'll put a link to The Factual Feminist on our website. Well, I had the great pleasure of debating the best-selling author Naomi Klein at the Sydney Opera House this week, and the subject, is capitalism compatible with tackling climate change? Klein is author of several high-profile books, including most recently, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. Now, she's one of the world's leading figures on the ideological left. She's a brilliant polemicist. And I would say this, she's wrong to say that capitalism is destroying the planet. Now, according to Klein, only by ending capitalism can we truly decarbonise the economy. Now, I think she's always worth reading, even if you disagree with her thesis. Her interview with The Guardian is on this week's reading list. Just search RN's Between the Lines. So that's it for this week. I'm Tom Switzer. Let's catch up next week.